Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at a classic text from the Western philosophical canon, The Republic of Plato. Specifically, we'll be looking at Book 10 of The Republic, where Plato argues against allowing poetry to exist in the ideal city. There's a lot leading up to that. There's a lot to fill in terms of the details of that position and how we get there. And that's what this video is all about. We'll walk through the classic text, or the original text together. Not the original, but a translation of it. And sort of figure out why Plato arrives at this position that he does. Because it's a bit surprising, you might think. But before we do that, I'd just like to thank everybody who's been supporting the channel so far. It's early days, so I'm still sort of feeling things out and getting a sense of whether and to what extent there's an audience for this sort of content. So any support at this point is greatly appreciated, and well, I'm sure it'll be just as appreciated later on. And yeah, so this is the sort of thing that I do on this channel. I read through classic texts and give my commentary along the way and try to decode them for a general but I guess reasonably informed audience. You might get assigned this, if you're in college, you might get assigned some of these works in a philosophy course, in which case maybe this is helpful for sort of walking you through some of these dense and difficult texts. But otherwise, for your average person who maybe doesn't have the time to dive into a full read through on your own of the Republic, right? It's a pretty daunting text. There's lots of things to keep track of. It's a pretty unfamiliar writing style, at least if you haven't read a lot of philosophy. But I have, and so I'm here to explain what's going on in these philosophical texts. Some of them classic, all of them classic so far, but in the future I'd like to do the same for more modern philosophical works as well. So what's going on in academic philosophy today? What are the kind of things that are being argued about and discussed? So that's what we're doing on this channel, and thanks for all your support in the meantime, especially, as I said, early on. Okay, so let's get to it, right? This is The Republic by Plato, and I don't know how much introducing of Plato I really need to do. I mean, he's pretty infamous in the Western philosophical canon. Even if you don't know anything about philosophy, you may have heard about Plato before. He sort of set the stage for the way that philosophy is done in terms of, determining a lot of the topics that still make up the core philosophical issues of the Western philosophical tradition, at least. Epistemology, right? The study of what is knowledge, what is the nature of reality, do abstract objects exist, what is justice, right? Giving accounts of things in a rational way, driven by argument, logic, and reason, rather than emotion and sentiment and things like that. And so we set up basically a huge system that has been commented upon and developed and disputed and so on and so forth throughout the history of the Western philosophical canon. And the Republic is just maybe the quintessential dialogue where he does this for political philosophy, where he sets the groundwork for questions like what is justice, what is the ideal society, how should we run things if we were being maximally rational, basically. What's the most ideal way to set up and maintain a society that's guided by reason? Spoiler alert, it's not a democracy. Maybe some of you have known that, but yeah, he has this system about how to divide society with, I think it's sometimes called perfectionism, where it's a society that's led by an enlightened monarchy of philosopher kings who understand the way things work and who are maximally rational and understand more than anyone else in society. They're the most wise and learned people, and they're the ones who should be in charge, according to Plato. And the Republic, which is 10 books. Books. It's a pretty hefty tome, but it's not absurd. It's you can put it on, bind it in a single book and put it on a shelf, right? It's not crazy long, but it's hefty, and it goes through the creation of an ideal city according to Plato. It's written, of course, in dialogue form. Plato wrote dialogues, mostly between Socrates and some poor sucker who Socrates is harassing the whole time and just talking around and trying to drive them into a corner rhetorically. Well, that's a little bit uncharitable, but basically Socrates functions as the mouthpiece for Plato, where Socrates will ask a question to somebody and they'll give an answer, and there's this back and forth where Socrates gets progressively more and more rigorous in his argumentation and arrives eventually at a position that he likes or a position that he doesn't like. Not a lot of, or many dialogues don't actually resolve on having arrived at the final answer to the question that's being posed, but some of them do. And the bit that we'll be looking at today, it does. There is a clear answer to this question of whether or not poetry should be allowed in the city. The answer is no, and Socrates is convinced of that, and we're going to look at the arguments for that now, right? So this is why it appears in Book 10 of the Republic, because Plato's in that book, or in the Republic, he's creating the ideal city, and one of the questions is, should we allow things like fiction or media, or the arts, the imitative arts, into the city? That would be, a maximally rational city. Would we allow the arts? Would we allow media? Would we allow fiction? Would we allow poetry? And all of that falls under poetry. And the answer is no. No, we wouldn't allow any of that. It's not good. And we're going to learn why. Okay. Now, the edition that I'm using is a translation by Paul Shorey. This is public domain, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's on Internet Archive. There's a link to that. It's in WorldCat, listed as open access, so it's on that. So go there and get it yourself, and read it yourself. This is... I didn't pay for this. This isn't proprietary. I'm pretty sure that the translation is public domain. I'm very confident that is. I firmly, sincerely believe that this is a public domain translation, and the edition was publicly available, and that's where I got it from. I have just snipped it to begin at Book 10, but here's the relevant information, and I encourage you to get it yourself. I won't be hosting the file on my website, but I will be linking to where you can see the file yourself. This is volume 2, right, because it's in 2 volumes, books 6 to 10. This is volume 2 because it's book 10. And the translation, again, this is 1935, so we're well beyond the public domain copyright expiration date there. So blah, 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 copyright stuff. But anyway, even if this is under some sort of copyright issue, this should be sufficiently transformative, and I firmly believe that this is an example of fair use. So there you go. There's my caveats. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So Book 10 of the Republic, where Plato, by way of Socrates, is going to argue against allowing poetry to exist in the ideal city. Now, in this translation, I said refers to Socrates, right? So when it says I said, that's Socrates. He said is Glaucon, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's Glaucon. Now, when I do I'm not going to do different voices, but I'll try and make it obvious who's talking. But I might, ignore the I said and he said and say Socrates says and Glaucon says. I might do that. Let me just see one thing real quick. Oh, and this has the Greek as well, because this is the Loeb edition. That's for those of you who know Greek. Great. Okay. I'm pretty sure it's Glaucon. It better be Glaucon. If it's not Glaucon, then this video is doomed. So anyway. All right, let's go. Book 10. And truly, Socrates said, "Many other considerations assure me that we were entirely right in our organization of the state, and especially, I think, in the matter of poetry." Okay, so now he's introducing the topic. The topic is poetry, right? So he's very pleased with the work so far. This is coming at the end of the Republic. This is the last book. And Socrates is saying, yep, we've done such a great job so far, but I'm really impressed with what we said about poetry. Now, poetry doesn't just mean poems, right? In fact, it means, it comes from the Greek word poesis, which I think just means to make something. So it's a type of craft, really. But it's a type of craft that refers to, well, something usually for entertainment purposes, right? So comedy falls under poetry. Plays, Greek plays, fall under poetry. Epic poems like Homer fall under poetry. Any sort of basically fiction or media presentation that's fictional, that's imitative, basically fiction, right? Think like TV shows and movies, right? That's poetry, right? That's the sort of thing that he would have in mind, but the ancient Greek version of that. And Socrates is saying, yep, we did a great job with the whole city, especially the poetry stuff. And Glaucon says, what about that? What about it? What do you mean? And Socrates says, in refusing to admit at all so much of it as is imitative. For that it is certainly not to be received is, I think, still more plainly apparent now that we have distinguished the several parts of the soul. So he thinks it's great that we've banned it, right? It's certainly not to be received. So much of it as is imitative, right? So there's like some, and we're going to see there's some exceptions to certain kinds of poetry and certain kinds of music, right? That's another one. Music that's allowed, specifically the kind that's like pious and good in terms of, songs about how great the gods are. Those are allowed, right? But any sort of fiction is not allowed. And like there's some exceptions, but in general, if it imitates reality in a way, if it's imitative, if it engages in mimesis, then get rid of it. And he'll explain what that is in a bit, so don't worry if you're not getting it from just my quick glosses right now. I'm just trying to get to the part where he explains it himself. And he says that it's more apparent now because we've distinguished parts of the soul. So there's some metaphysics has gone on before in books 1 to 9, right? So there's some metaphysics, there's some political philosophy, and we'll see. The second half of book 10 is further about the soul and metaphysics, and specifically the immortality of the soul. But for now, he's just setting up his discussion of poetry. Glaucon says, what do you mean by that? And Socrates says, well, between ourselves, or just between us, for you will not betray me to the tragic poets and all other imitators, that kind of art seems to be a corruption of the mind of all listeners who do not possess an antidote, a knowledge of its real nature. Okay, so this is like a funny line. Well, between us, right? So just between us, and don't go out telling, all the poets that I want to ban them, but just between you and me, Glaucon, old buddy, I'm pretty sure that everything they do is just a corruption to the mind of all the listeners who do not possess as an antidote a knowledge of the thing's real nature. And this is setting up the main argument against poetry in the Republic, or in Book 10 here, which is that poetry, insofar as it imitates reality, is a corruption, or can lead to corruption of the people who view it when they don't know about the real thing, right? They don't have knowledge of the thing being imitated. Insofar as they don't have knowledge of the thing being imitated, and yet they're seeing an imitation, their minds are being corrupted. That's the idea. And this is going to get repeated, and he's going to give arguments for it, but he's just sort of giving the thesis right now. Glaucon says, what is your idea in saying this? Or what do you mean by that? Socrates says, I must speak out. I said, though a certain love and reverence for Homer that has possessed me from a boy would stay me from speaking. Right, so he's saying that even though I love poetry, I love Homer, it's great, but I just can't, I can't deny it anymore. We just got to get rid of it because it's bad, right? For he, Homer, appears to have been the first teacher and the beginner of all these beauties of tragedy. Yet all the same, we must not honor a man above the truth, but, as I say, speak our minds. Okay, so this is like a sort of valiant statement by Socrates of the importance of the truth. Right? It's all about the truth. Right? We must not honor a man above the truth. Meaning, no matter how much I love Homer, no matter how much I love poetry, no matter how much I love the arts, tragedies, comedies, whatever, no matter how much I love all that stuff, if reason compels me with argument and sound logic that we shouldn't allow poetry in the ideal city, then that's what I gotta accept, right? I gotta accept it. And this is, I think it's a great example of the kind of difficulty that people have with philosophy in terms of, and just with life in general, I guess, when, reason or rationality tells us to do one thing, but we want to do something else. This conflict happens all the time. It's very old. And here's Socrates sort of putting it front and center in a philosophical text, right? He's saying, look, reason tells me got to get rid of poetry, no matter how much I love it. Even though I love it, I can't resist I can't help but being persuaded by reason. And this is one of the reasons why Socrates is sort of sanctified by the Stoics, for example, right? As somebody who just like lived their life according to reason, at least in some respects. Right? I mean, on the one hand, Socrates is kind of like a creepy old man in some ways. He kind of had a thing for little boys, or at least young boys, maybe not little boys, but young boys, right? Which not great, I guess, to put it mildly. So he clearly wasn't living like entirely in accordance with reason, but often enough he put reason before his own well-being and before what he wanted in often enough cases, right? So famously, Socrates chose to die rather than to submit to something that he believed was wrong in the famous Apology of Socrates, and so on and so forth. And right now, here's like another example, right, where no matter how much I love poetry, if reason compels me to banish it from the city, then so it must be. Okay, by all means, Glaucon says, right, go ahead, say what you're going to say, Socrates. And Socrates says, listen then, or rather, answer my question. Glaucon says, yeah, sure, ask it. Socrates says, could you tell me in general what imitation is? For neither do I myself quite apprehend what it would be at. Right, so it's kind of weird. Socrates says we're going to banish imitative poetry, but he doesn't know what imitation is. This is kind of like a sort of roundabout way of just giving a definition, right? So he's trying to give a definition of an important term. This is really good philosophical practice, right? If there's a key term in your thesis statement, right, in the statement that you're trying to, or in the position that you're trying to argue for or against, you need to define those terms clearly. And this time he's talking about imitation, right? So what is imitation? Let's get that out of the way first. And so he asks Glaucon, what do you think imitation is? And Glaucon says, well, is it likely then that I should apprehend? Right. Basically, what that means is, how do you think I'm going to know that? Right? Why do you think I would know? You're the one who's like, super smart. You're like Socrates. Why would I know what imitation is? And Socrates says, it would be nothing strange, since it often happens that the dimmer vision sees things in advance of the keener. Right? So sometimes dummies see things before smart people sometimes that happens, right? In fact, it probably happens all the time, right? It often happens that dummies see things before geniuses. So he's basically calling Glaucon a dummy here, or one of dimmer vision. And Glaucon says, well, yeah, sure, that is so. But in your presence, I could not even be eager to try to state anything that appears to me, but do you yourself consider it, right? So, yeah, but even if that's the case, if I'm talking to you, Socrates, I don't stand a chance. So you just, why don't you just go? You just do your thing. Okay. So Socrates says, shall we then start at the inquiry at our inquiry at this point by our customary procedure? We are in a habit, I take it, of positing a single idea or form in the case of the various multiplicities to which we give the same name. So this is kind of like the Socratic method, right? So this is the customary procedure where he's talking about basically when Socrates is in a dialogue, he'll say, tell me about justice, or tell me about whatever the concept may be. And the way he goes about doing it and having these conversations is that he'll say, tell me, I'll posit a single idea or a form, and he's got a footnote about sometimes form just means an idea. Sometimes it means like Plato's like metaphysical, like the form sort of thing. Here we don't have to read too much into it here. Think of it as a concept, right? Positing a single idea or form or concept, I guess we could say. In the case of the various multiplicities to which we give the same name, right? So think about justice, for example. I'm going to posit justice and ask you, tell me about justice. And then you're going to give a bunch of examples of things that are just, right? Or things that meet the definition of justice. So the sort of everyday, intuitive, common sense understanding of what a thing that's just is, right? And then we proceed from there, right? So that's what he's proposing now for imitation, right? Because Glaucon says, I don't even know where to start. And Socrates says, okay, how about we do it this way? The usual way. I'll say, let's talk about imitation, and we'll go through a couple things that fit the bill, and we'll try and get to the bottom of it, right? Do you understand or do you not understand? Glaucon says, I do. In the present case, then, let us take any multiplicity you please. For example, there are many couches and tables. There are many couches and tables. Of course, said Glaucon. Right? Couches and tables are like a pretty common stock example in Plato, where he tries to make this point about the forms, and it gets repeated over and over. So pay attention. Right? Of course. Socrates says, but these utensils imply, I suppose, only two ideas or forms, one of a couch and one of a table. Glaucon says, yes. Right, so this is the point that's being made, and this is like a classic Platonic point, right? There are multiple couches and chairs, right? But there are only two ideas, one of a couch, one of a couch and one of a table. Sorry, it's talking about couches and tables, right? So, right, another example, right? I have two glasses here, two pairs of glasses, right? But there's only one idea that these two things represent, namely glasses. That's the thing here, right? I don't want to say that's the idea, but because it gets confusing when you're talking about ideas, but that's the point here, right? There are many, right? There's a multiplicity of couches and tables, right? Individual couches and tables out there in the world, but there's only two ideas or forms, one of a couch and one of a table. Glaucon says yes. And Socrates says, are we not also in the habit of saying that a craftsman who produces either of them fixes his eyes on the idea or form, and so makes in the one case the couches and in the others the tables that we use, and similarly of other things? For no craftsman makes the idea itself. How could he? Right? So that's pretty good. He says when a craftsperson makes something, they have in mind, right? They fix the eye, right? They fix their mind's eye, and this is eye in a metaphorical sense, on the idea or the form of a couch or a table, and then proceeds to make the thing, the physical thing, right? But he doesn't make the idea of a couch or a table. The idea of a couch or a table, or the concept of it, exists before the craftsman, right? By no means, Glaucon says, does the craftsman produce the idea of the couch or the table. But now consider what name you would give to this craftsman. What one? Says Glaucon. Socrates says, him who makes all the things that all the handicraftsmen severally produce. Okay. But now consider what name you would give to this craftsman. So now he's talking about, he's introducing a craftsman in particular, right? This isn't referring backwards, it's referring forward, right? To now consider this new craftsman, what would you give the name to this one? And Glaucon says, which one? He says, him who makes all the things that all handicrafters severally produce, right? So what about a craftsman who could make anything, right? Just all the things that an individual, like a couch maker or a watchmaker or a glasses maker, right? Somebody who could make all of that stuff. What would you call that kind of craftsman? And Glaucon says, well, a truly clever and wondrous man, you tell of. And Socrates says, but wait, and you will say so indeed. For this same handicraftsman is not only able to make all the implements, but he produces all plants and animals, including himself, and thereto earth and heavens and the gods and all things in heaven and all in Hades under the earth. So not just making all the stuff, but he can actually produce life, right? He can make plants and animals. He can make himself. He can make gods and heavens and the underworld, right? And all divinity, right? He can make everything, right? Not just tables and chairs and glasses. He can make all that stuff too. Glaucon says, a most marvelous sophist, he said. And sophist is, sophistry is kind of like the art of rhetoric, right? As would have been understood, where you convince people to, it's the art of being able to convince people through rhetoric and persuasion to agree with your position, or to create some sort of belief, or to convince them to hold some sort of belief that doesn't necessarily track the truth, right? And sophistry in ancient Greece, I mean, you could look it up, what the sophists were. They were basically teachers. They would basically teach rhetoric to people and prepare them for political life. So, if you've ever seen a politician answer a question indirectly, or be asked a question and then answer a different question, or be asked a question and then pivot to like a stronger position of theirs rather than like deal with the question directly, that's sophistry, right? So basically with this line here, a most marvelous sophist, Glaucon is basically expressing incredulity, right? He's saying, well, come on, basically, come on now. Oh, gee, I didn't even see that word. Socrates says, are you incredulous? Said Socrates. Tell me, do you deny altogether the possibility of such a craftsman? Or do you admit that in a sense there could be such a creator of these things, and in another sense not? Or do you not perceive that you yourself would be able to make all these things in a way? Right? So why are you incredulous of this? And he gives some different possibilities, right? Do you think that there's no way that this could happen as a matter of possibility, right? There could be no such craftsman? Or that maybe there could be in one sense, but not in another? Or do you just think that you can't do it? And Socrates says, and Glaucon says, in what way, I ask you? Right, in what way? So which way? And Socrates says, there is no difficulty, but it is something that the craftsman can make everywhere and quickly. You could do it most quickly if you should choose to take a mirror and carry it about everywhere. You will speedily produce the sun and all the things in the sky, and speedily the earth and yourself and all the other animals and implements and plants and all the objects of now which we just spoke. So basically, Socrates is saying, if you carry around a mirror, you can create, in a sense, everything around you. Right? If you have a mirror, I wish I had a mirror. I don't know, a phone. Pretend this is a mirror, right? It's a phone, right? And I just had this mirror, and it reflects everything. I mean, it kind of reflects some stuff. If you have one of these bad boys, you can walk around and create everything. Everything that gets reflected in the mirror is created by the mirror, according to Socrates. That's the thing. So that's how it's possible for somebody to create all of this stuff. And Glaucon says, well, what are you talking about? He says, no, it's no problem at all. Just carry around a mirror and you can create all this stuff. And Glaucon says, well, yeah, the appearance of them, but not the reality and the truth, right? That's just a reflection, we would say, of, a plant, right? Or, if I have a mirror and I look at a plant, or an animal, or an object, whatever it is, with a mirror, and I reflect it and I see the thing in the mirror, I don't see the real thing, I just see the appearance of the thing, right? I see a reflection of the thing, but not the thing itself, because the thing itself is being projected onto the mirror. Excellent, said Socrates, and you come to the aid of the argument opportunely, for I take it that the painter too belongs to this class of producer, does he not? Ah, okay, so now the painter. Of course. But, you will say, I suppose that his creations are not real and true, and yet, after a fashion, the painter too makes a couch, does he not? Yes, said Glaucon, the appearance of one he does make. Okay, so now we've moved from the mirror to the case of the painter, right? Somebody who paints, right? Somebody who paints a landscape has, in a sense, produced the appearance of the landscape. And that's the kind of craftsman that Socrates is now talking about, right? The craftsman who can create anything, no matter what it is, who can create all things in the world, whether you've heard of them or not, is a painter, really. Somebody who basically takes a mirror wherever they go and can produce instantly a reflection, right? A painter is kind of like that, right? Where they produce the appearance or the reflection or the semblance of a real thing itself. They don't produce the real thing, they produce an imitation of it, right? They produce the appearance of it. Okay. So that's part one. That is part one of Book 10 of the Republic. So we've gone from, right, Socrates is very happy that we've banned poetry. That's good. And then Socrates says, even though I like poetry, so he's getting that out of the way, he likes poetry, but we have to ban it because reason compels it. And in order to get the argument set up, because that's a tough argument to make, even for him, as somebody who loves poetry, to do that, he's going to have to define what he means by imitation. And so we're working towards this definition now by means of looking at craftspeople whose art is imitation, namely a painter, right? That's one, or a sculptor, right? Somebody who creates the appearance of something, not the thing itself. And that's the only way that this sort of craftsman makes sense, right? A craftsman who can create anything, literally anything, right? Who can create plants, people, mysterious beasts, objects, right? Things like that would have to be one who could only create the appearance of those things and not the things themselves. Right? So the appearance, but not the reality and the truth. And Socrates says, good, yeah, that's the point, right? So a painter just makes the appearance of the thing. Okay, part 2. What about the cabinet maker? Well, you're not just saying now that he doesn't make the idea or the form, which we say is the real couch, or the couch in itself, but only some particular couch. Yes, I was, said Glaucon. Okay, so this is important because this goes into Platonic metaphysics, right? So Plato thinks that only the ideas of things are real or true, right? The ideas of things, the forms of things are the real elements of the universe, right? So the idea of the couch is the real couch, or the couch in itself, right? And a particular couch is kind of an imitation of the idea of a couch. It's an instantiation of the idea of a couch. So it's not the couch. It's not the real couch with a capital C. It's just some particular couch, right? And that's what the couch maker, or I guess the carpenter, or the cabinet maker, he probably makes couches and cabinets, right? The same guy who makes couches probably makes cabinets too in ancient Greece, I guess. That's the sense I'm getting. And so Socrates is clarifying here, right? Like, you know, the idea, which is the real couch, is not produced by the craftsman, right? The craftsman doesn't produce the idea of couch. He didn't invent the idea of the couch. He just makes couches, right? Then if he does not make that which really is, he could not be said to make real being, but something that resembles the real being, but is not that. But if anyone should say that being in the complete sense belongs to the work of the cabinet maker, or to that of any other handicraftsman, it seems that he would say what is not true, right? So that it seems like when the craftsman makes the couch or the table, he's making something that resembles the real thing, right? The real thing being the idea of the couch or the table, right? And so basically, you know, the things that the craftsman makes are not the truth itself. And if you were to say that a craftsman makes the real thing, then you'd be mistaken, right? You would say something that is not true. Now, of course, we can debate this, right? Is, you know, and this is again going back to the systematicity of Plato's thinking, right? Where he's got this whole system of how metaphysics works and how the forms are, or the true ideas of things, or where reality is, because the forms are unchanging, and whereas the world of appearances, which are constantly changing, and, you know, individual couches can go in and out of existence. They can be perfect, or they can't be perfect. They can be good or bad, flawed, or approach perfection without ever being perfect. They come and go, but the idea of the couch remains, nevertheless. And that's the ideal, that's the idea, that's the form of the couch. And the craftsman makes couches that try to resemble that, right? He doesn't make the real being the real couch, but something that resembles the real being, even though it's not that. Glaucon says, yep, that sounds good. Or no, that would be the view, Glaucon says, of those who are versed in this kind of reasoning. Yeah, okay. Socrates says, we must not be surprised, then, if this too is only a dim adumbration in comparison with reality. No, we must not, said Glaucon, right? So, when you see an individual couch, that is a dim adumbration in comparison with reality, right? So this is much less good or satisfying than reality, the truth of the form of the couch. Right? Socrates says, shall we then use these various examples in our quest for the true nature of this imitator? Glaucon says, if you please. We get then these three couches. One that in nature, which I take it, we would say that God produces, or who else? Right, so the one couch in nature produced by God is the form of the couch. That's the idea. So God created the idea of the couch, according to Plato's metaphysics. And again, like, we could dispute this, but like, in this context, we're sort of, we have to take on, in the interest of charity, the premises from other parts of Plato's system to make sense of this argument now, right? So we got to assume that the form or the idea of the couch is the best. That's the one that exists in nature, meaning it's not produced by any craftsman. It's not produced by us. It's instead produced by God, right? The couch, the form of the couch, that's one couch, right? Because there are three couches, right? There's the couch that God produces, right? The form, the idea of the couch. And then there's the one that the carpenter made, right? And then there was one in which the carpenter made. Glaucon says, yes. So that's the second couch, right? There's the couch that God made, the idea of the couch the carpenter made, which is like the physical couch that you and I sit on, right? And then the one which the painter made. Is that not so? Glaucon says, so be it. Socrates says, the painter, then the cabinet maker, and God. These are these three presiding over three kinds of couches? Glaucon says, yes, three. So there are three kinds of couches, right? The idea of the couch that we sit on, and a painting or an imitation or a picture or a reflection or a mere semblance of a couch, right? Those are the three kinds of couches there are. And each of those are associated with either, God, a craftsman, or a painter. Socrates says, now God, whether because he so willed or because some compulsion was laid upon him not to make more than one couch in nature, so wrought and created only one, the couch which really and in itself is. But two or more such were never created by God and never will come into being. So now he's saying, why is there only one idea of a couch? Why is there only one couch? Well, because God decided that there was only one idea of a couch, but you couldn't have more than one idea of a couch anyway. And Glaucon says, how so? Socrates says, because if he should make two, or if he should make only two, there would again appear one of which they both would possess the form or idea, and that would be the couch that really is in and of itself, and not the other two. Right, Glaucon said. Yeah. So here's like a logical reason why there can only be one real couch, right? One idea of a couch. Because if there were two, there would have to be one thing in virtue of which those two things are both couches. And so you basically beg the question, you kick the can down the road, and you say, okay, well, what makes those two ideas of couch actually ideas of a couch? Well, it's because they both partake in this more general idea, of which there's only one, of a couch, right? So here's like a logical reason why there can only be one, or a logical argument, independent of, the rest of the system, right? So he's arguing for the idea that there is only one form or idea of anything, really. The couch is just the example that he uses. Socrates says, God, then I take it, knowing this and wishing to be the real author of the couch that has real being and not of some particular couch, nor yet a particular cabinet maker, produced it in nature unique. So there's only one. God produced one couch in nature because that's what he wanted. He wanted to produce what was real and not an imitation of something real like the cabinet maker. So it seems, said Glaucon. Socrates says, shall we then call him its true and natural begetter, or something of that kind? Should we call God the true and natural begetter of couches and all things, really? Glaucon says, yeah, that would certainly be right, since it is by and in nature that he has made this and all other things. Right, namely all other things of which there are ideas, right? So there is in nature the idea of glasses, the idea of a phone, the idea of a pen, right? Those exist in nature. They were authored by God, according to Plato. And all these particular individual things are instances of that idea. And what of the carpenter? Socrates says, shall we not call him the creator of a couch? Glaucon says, yes. And Socrates says, shall we also say that the painter is the creator and maker of that sort of thing, right? Of a couch, namely. And Glaucon says, by no means. Socrates says, what will you say he is in relation to the couch then? So why would you say that the carpenter creates a couch, but the painter does not create a couch? And Glaucon says, this seems to me the most reasonable designation for him, that he is the imitator of the thing which those others produce. Socrates says, very good. Right. The producer of the product three removes, or thrice removed, or three times removed from nature, you call the imitator, right? Glaucon says, by all means. Okay, so we have three layers here, right? There's the thing itself, the idea. There's only one that's made by God. Then we have the particular thing created by people, right? By the carpenter, the couch, individual couches, which are imitations of the true one idea of the couch. And then below that, we have the painter, who paints or imitates the individual couches created by a craftsman. And so in that sense, there's three layers, and the imitator, the painter, is three times removed from the truth, right? The truth is one, the carpenter is two, and the painter is three. So an imitator is three times removed from nature. Glaucon says, yeah, that sounds right. Okay. So that's like the main analogy that Socrates is setting up here, right? There's this three-part structure of the thing in nature, the thing itself, the reality, the thing created, which is an imitation of that reality, and then the imitation of the imitation, right? Of the particular instantiation of the thing in nature. This, then, will apply to the maker of tragedies also, if he is an imitator and is in his nature three times removed from the king and the truth, as are all other imitators. So now this is he's going to move towards poetry, right? Towards the maker of tragedies, right? This person, like a painter, is also an imitator and three times removed from the truth. It would seem so, said Glaucon. Socrates says, we are in agreement then about the imitator, right? So now we've defined our term. We've defined what is imitation. Imitation happens when you're three times removed from nature. But tell me now about this painter, Socrates says. Do you think that when he tries to imitate, or do you think that what he tries to imitate is in each case the thing itself in nature or the works of the craftsman? I sort of got ahead of myself, but now he's filling this in, right? It's the works of the craftsman, said Glaucon. So the painter imitates a particular couch, right? The painter doesn't create the idea of a couch. He imitates a particular couch that he has in mind. Socrates says, is it the reality of them or the appearance? Define that further point. Glaucon says, what do you mean? This, said Socrates, does a couch differ from itself according as you view it, or does a couch differ from itself according as you view it from the side or from the front or in any other way? Or does it differ not at all? In fact, though it appears different, and so of other things. Glaucon says that is the way of it. It appears other, but it differs not at all, right? So when we look at things from different angles, right? If we look at a couch straight ahead, if we look at a couch from, the floor, if we look at a couch from above, it looks different, but it's still the same couch, right? Socrates just confirming that Glaucon knows that. It appears different, but it differs not at all, right? Socrates says, consider then this very point. To which is painting directed in every case? To the imitation of reality as it is, or of appearance as it appears? Is it an imitation of a phantasm or of the truth? And Glaucon says, well, it's of a phantasm. Socrates says, then the mimetic art is far removed from the truth, and this, it seems, is the reason why it can produce everything, because it touches or lays hold only of a small part of the object, and that a phantom. As, for example, a painter, we say, will paint us a cobbler, a carpenter, and every other craftsman, though he himself has no expertise in any of these arts. But nevertheless, if he were a good painter, by exhibiting at a distance his picture of a carpenter, he would deceive children and foolish men, and would make them believe it to be a real carpenter. Okay. So now you see where he's going with this, right? He's saying, well, look, painters paint the appearance of things, not the real thing. And painters, for that reason, are very far removed from the truth of the matter, from nature, right? And in fact, they only paint things from one perspective, right? From a single point of view. And that's just one piece of the thing, right? So it's an appearance of an appearance. It's an imitation of an imitation. And for that reason, it can deceive people. And this is going to come in for, the reason why Socrates thinks that this stuff should be banned. Because it could fool people as an imitation of an appearance by a good painter. It could fool people into thinking that a carpenter or whatever really does have those qualities, even if they in fact don't. Glaucon says, why not? Yeah, sure. Socrates says, but for all that, my friend, this, I take it, is why we ought to bear in mind. This is what we ought to bear in mind in all such cases. When anyone reports to us of someone that he has met a man who knows all the crafts and everything else that men severally know, and that there is nothing that he does not know more exactly than anybody else, our tacit rejoinder must be that he is a simple fellow who apparently has met some magician or sleight-of-hand man, an imitator, and has been deceived by him into the belief that he is all-wise, because of his own ability to put the proof and distinguish knowledge, ignorance, and imitation, or because of his own inability to put to the proof and distinguish knowledge, ignorance, and imitation. Most true, Glaucon says. Okay, that's part 2, done. Right, so Socrates is saying, well, if you meet somebody who says, I met somebody who knows how to do everything, who knows everything about everything, and who's just like a, amazing person who has everything figured out. If we meet somebody like that, we'll think that, okay, well, you probably don't know what you're talking about, right? If you were rational and knowledgeable, you would know that it's impossible to know everything. And if somebody were trying to trick you into thinking that they know everything, if you had a certain level of knowledge, you'd be able to identify that person as a fake. You'd be able to identify the phoniness, right? And, that's... Well, this is going to be important. This is going to build, but that's why this works. Okay, part 3. Then, Socrates says, have we not next to scrutinize tragedy and its leader, Homer, since some people tell us that these poets know all the arts and all things human pertaining to virtue and vice, and all things divine. For the good poet, if he is to poetize things rightly, must, they argue, create with knowledge, or else be unable to create. So we must consider whether these critics have not fallen in with such imitators and have been deceived by them, so that looking upon their works they cannot perceive that these are three times removed from reality, and easy to produce without knowledge of the truth. For it is phantoms, not realities, that they produce. Or is there something in their claim, and do good poets really know the things about which the multitudes fancy they speak well? Right, so now he's right on topic. Now we're back, now we're on to poetry, right? And he says, this is the problem with poetry, right? People think that Homer, right, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Homer is great, and he's so wise, and he knows all these things, and he can write this story about these ancient heroes because he's so wise and he knows everything, right? And we look to Homer as this great wise old sage who just understands how all things work, and he's created this world with such intricate details, and this is exactly how things work, and people praise Homer as some genius, especially in terms of values, right? So Homeric values that appear the heroism of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus, for example, right? And this is something that Socrates has a real problem with, especially in the context of a just society where you have these folks like Homer producing these works that convince people of a particular conception of good and bad, of right and wrong, when Homer himself might not really know what he's talking about. But he knows enough to fool the masses, and the masses are fooled because they don't realize that poetry is 3 times removed from reality. There you go, right? So we got to talk about this now, Socrates says, right? We must certainly examine the matter, says Glaucon. Yes, indeed, sir. Socrates says, do you suppose, then, that if a man were able to produce both the exemplar and the semblance, he would be eager to abandon himself to the fashioning of phantoms and set this in the forefront of his life as the best thing he had, right? So this is fun. Now the argument, he gives a lot of fun, good arguments throughout this. But he's saying, basically, if you have somebody who could create a real thing or an imitation of it, would anybody in their right mind give up producing the real thing and instead create an appearance or the phantom of it and set it at the forefront of his life as best he had, right? If you could be a couch maker or a painter of couches, you would choose to be the couch maker, right? Right? If you could make a real couch, like if you really could do that, you would do that instead of like painting a couch, right? Now, I don't know, people might disagree, but that's, Socrates is relying on an answer to this question, and the answer being no, right? And the idea is that, but, Socrates says, I take it, if he had genuine knowledge of the things he imitates, he would far rather devote himself to real things than to the imitation of them, and would endeavor to leave after him many noble deeds and works as memorials of himself, and would be more eager to be the theme of praise than the praiser. Right? So if you really knew how to, run a city, or how to, win a war, presumably you would go out and do it, not write books about it, right? You wouldn't just write bestsellers about, how I would end the war in wherever, right? If you really could, you would go do it, because it would be much better to be remembered as the person who did the thing rather than someone who just wrote about what you thought was best to do, right? Glaucon says, I think so. For there is no parity in the honor and the gain, right? There's no, to be a best-selling author or like a general or a leader who ended a war, it's apples and oranges, buddy. Like, those are just two totally different things. Gotta get a drink. Let us not then demand a reckoning from Homer or any other of the poets on other matters by asking them if any one of them was a physician and not merely an imitator of a physician's talk. What men any poet, old or new, is reported to have restored to health as Asclepius did, or what disciples of the medical art he left after him as Asclepius did his descendants. Hold on. This not confused me. Let us not, then, demand a reckoning from Homer or any other poets on other matters, by asking them if any one of them was a physician, and not merely an imitator of a physician's talk. What man any poet, old or new, is reported to have restored to health, as Asclepius, who was an ancient physician, I assume, or what disciples of the medical art he left after him, as Asclepius did his descendants. Right, so let's ask Homer, if you really could heal people, where are your patients and where are your followers? Where are your disciples who carried on and passed down your craft over the years? If you actually knew how to do that, right, how to heal people. And let us dismiss the other arts and not question them about them. But concerning the greatest and finest of things which Homer undertakes to speak, wars and generalship and the administration of cities and the education of men, it is surely fair to question him and ask, okay. Sorry. I see. So he said, we're not going to, let's not harass Homer about, whether he was a physician and healed any people, right? Because he doesn't write about that. He's not, it's no fault against Homer that he, hasn't healed anybody or left behind a school of physicians or doctors, right? That's not a big deal because he didn't write about that stuff. So we're not going to go down that road. We're not going to bother him about not being a good doctor, right? But we should ask him about his expertise on this stuff, the greatest and finest of things of which Homer does undertakes to speak. Wars and generalship and the administration of cities and the education of men. It is surely fair to question him and ask, friend Homer, if you are not at the third remove from truth, or if you are not 3 times removed from the truth and reality in human excellence, being merely that creator of phantoms whom we defined as the imitator, but if you are even in the second place and were capable of knowing what pursuits make men better or worse in private or public life, tell us what city was better governed owing to you, even as Lacedaemon was because of Lycurgus, and many other cities great and small because of other legislators. But what city credits you with having been a good legislator and having benefited them? Italy and Sicily say this of Carandas, and we say it of Solon, but who says it of you? Will he be able to name any? Right, so here's Socrates asking Homer, hypothetically, Homer, what city has benefited from your form of government? Right? What city sings your praises as the great legislator? Because you write so much about what makes a city great. You write so much political, right? About the rise and fall of cities. You write so much that's about topics pertaining to great cities. Which cities have you made great, sir? Will he be able to name any? Oh, and by the way, these are like references to where is it? Oh, okay. Yeah, these are references to, different figures in Greek history, right? So Solon was the famous lawgiver of Athens. Charondas, I don't know who that is. I guess the famous lawgiver of Italy and Sicily, of antiquity, right? But basically, like, where's Homer on this list, right? Would he be able to name any cities where, his ideas, led to the success of the city? Glaucon says, I think not, said Glaucon. At any rate, none is mentioned even by the Homerids themselves, right? Even by the people who love Homer, they don't, they're not saying that he led to the prosperity of any city. Socrates says, well then, is there any tradition of a war in Homer's time that was well conducted by his command or counsel? Meaning, did Homer, successfully lead any troops into war? Or, did he win a war? Did he win a battle? Was he a great general? Glaucon says, none. Nope. And Socrates says, well then, as might be expected of a man wise in practical affairs, are many and ingenious inventions for arts and business of life reported of Homer, as they are of Thales, the Milesian, and the Anacharsis, the Scythian. Meaning, did Homer invent anything? Right? Did he create anything? Even if, if not, if he's not a great politician, if he's not a great general, did he at least invent some stuff like Thales, the Milesian? Thales is the ancient Greek philosopher who thought that everything was, I think, water. Was he the water guy? I'm pretty sure Thales was the water guy. And Anacharsis, I don't know who that is, but basically some other really smart people who actually left behind things or a legacy or of produced of products, right? Glaucon says, nope, nothing whatever of the sort. Socrates says, well then, if no public service is credited to him, is Homer reported while he lived to have been a guide in education to men who took pleasure in associating with him and transmitted to posterity a certain Homeric way of life, just as Pythagoras was himself especially honored for this, and his successors, even to this day, denominating a certain way of life, the Pythagorean, are distinguished among their contemporaries, right? So, okay, if he didn't do that, then did he at least have, a way of life or a religion or a society? Did he lead a school of thought or a way of life like Pythagoras, right? So Pythagoras was if you've ever heard of the Pythagorean theorem, for example, right? Pythagoras was known as I don't want to say a cult leader, but I guess in a sense he was, where he had this way of life that was figured out, that he figured out, that was very attractive to many people, and he was a teacher, and his descendants and his followers and disciples created a Pythagorean school, a way of life, a cult, a group, or whatever you want to call it, right? And Socrates is asking, well, did Homer do that at least? Glaucon says, no, nothing of the sort is reported, right? Nothing of this sort either is reported. For Creophilos, Socrates, no, nothing of this sort is reported, says Glaucon. For Creophilos, I don't know who that is, Socrates, the friend of Homer, would perhaps be even more ridiculous than his name as a representative of the Homeric culture and education, if what is said about Homer is true. For the tradition is that Homer completely neglected in his own lifetime by that friend of the flesh. I don't know what any of this is. Of the Beef Clan. The Scholastic says that he was a Chian and epic poet. The friend of Homer would perhaps be more ridiculous than his name as a representative of Homeric culture and education. What was said about Homer is true. For the tradition is that Homer was completely neglected in his own lifetime by that friend of the flesh. Yeah, I don't know what this means. I guess the answer is no. No, Homer, he didn't have a way of life or a school of thought or anything. He didn't do that. He was neither a general nor was he a doctor. Obviously, he was not a great legislator, and he was not a teacher who professed a certain lifestyle in accordance with a set of values or virtues or anything like that. He didn't do any of that stuff. And that's the end of section 3. Okay. Section 4. Why, yes, that is tradition, said Socrates. But do you suppose, Glaucon, that if Homer had really been able to educate men and make them better, and had possessed not the art of imitation but real knowledge, he would not have acquired many companions and had been honored and loved by them? Right, so if he really was able to educate people and make them better, and he had real knowledge, not just knowledge of the art of imitation, then wouldn't he have acquired many companions and been honored and loved by them? But are we to believe that while Protagoras of Abdera and Prodicius of Chios and many others are able by private teachings to impress upon their contemporaries the conviction that they will not be capable of governing their homes or the city unless they put them in charge of their education and make themselves so beloved for this wisdom that their companions will all but carry them about on their shoulders, yet, forsooth, that Homer's contemporaries, if they had been able to help men to achieve excellence, would have suffered him or Hesiod to roam about rhapsodizing, and would not have clung to them far rather than to their gold, and constrained them to dwell with them in their homes, or failing to persuade them, would themselves have escorted them wherever they went until they should have sufficiently imbibed their culture? Okay, that sentence is a mouthful, but basically he's saying, like, if these guys really knew what they were talking about, if they really had wisdom, if they were really knowledgeable, if they knew how things worked, if they knew how to run a city, if they knew how to run your life, if they were really good, worthy educators, then wouldn't people have followed them around and forced them and begged them to teach them instead of just allowed them to, go from one town to another singing poetry all the time? Wouldn't that, the society at large would view that as a waste if these people really knew what they were talking about. They would instead be, following Homer around, asking him to give them life advice, like good old Epictetus. If you want to see my video on Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher who had lots of students, right? And this idea of, a philosopher having a bunch of students who would come to them and ask them, what's the best way to live life? What's the best way to run my house? What's the best way to succeed at my job? And the advice from philosophers would be to emphasize rationality, discipline, and things like that, right? And this will get one closer to the truth, right? Homer didn't leave any of that sort of legacy behind. And Socrates is saying, well, if he knew all that stuff, then he probably would have left that sort of legacy behind. But he didn't leave that sort of legacy behind. Therefore, he probably didn't know that stuff, right? He probably doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what he's writing about. And that's the point. What you say seems to me to be altogether true, Socrates, said Glaucon. Glaucon said that. Socrates says, shall we then lay it down that all the poetic tribe, beginning with Homer, are imitators of images of excellence and of the other things that they create, quote unquote, create, and do not lay hold on truth. But, as we were just now saying, the painter will fashion himself knowing nothing of the cobbler's art, what appears to be a cobbler to him, and likewise to those that know nothing but judge only by forms and colors. Right? So when a painter paints a cobbler, right, a shoemaker, he's going to paint what he thinks of as a cobbler, right? An impression of a cobbler. Painter doesn't necessarily know how to make shoes, but if you were to ask a painter to paint somebody making shoes, you'll get the painter's impression of the shoemaker. Right? They know nothing of the art of making shoes, but judge only by forms and colors, right? By just the way that things appear to them. Certainly, says Glaucon. And similarly, Socrates says, I suppose we shall say that the poet himself, knowing nothing but how to imitate, lays on with words and phrases the colors of the several arts in such fashion that others equally ignorant, who see things only through words will deem his words most excellent, whether he speaks in rhythm, meter, and harmony, about cobbling or generalship or anything whatsoever. So mighty is the spell that these adornments naturally exercise, that when they are stripped bare of their musical coloring and taken by themselves, I think you know what sort of a showing these sayings of the poets make, for you, I believe, have observed them. So he's saying that, look, a good poet can make it seem like they know, or can create a really good impression of what something is like. Even if they don't know about the thing, and even if what they say is false, right? Even if what they're saying is wrong, even if that's not actually what makes a good craftsman or a good general or whatever, right? If you describe it poetically, right, in rhythm and meter and harmony, if you set it up, or if you have, to use a modern example, if you, here's a great example. So crime shows, for example, right? A really good crime show, or a really good like medical drama, I don't know, like House, right? If you watch that and you don't know anything about medicine, you might be left with the impression that that's what it's like to be a doctor, right? Or that's what it's like to work in forensics. If you're watching, I don't know, like Bones or Criminal Minds or whatever, right? You might, if you don't know any better, think that, oh yeah, that must be what it's like to work in that sort of field, to be a doctor or to be a forensic analyst or whatever, right? You might be left with that impression because the show is so well done and everything sort of makes sense. It's self-contained. It's the effects are good, budget is good, the acting is good, the scripting is good, right? The imitative elements of those things are very good, but they're not necessarily accurate, and they're not good on account of their accuracy. That's not why we judge them. We don't judge them on account of how accurate they are. We judge them on account of the qualities of a good TV show, for example, right? But because of that, we might, as ignorant people, be left with the impression that that's what it's really like to be a doctor or, forensic analyst or whatever, right? But without all that stuff, without the if you were to just say, this is what a forensic analyst does, I guess you might not believe it as willingly if it's not in the context of a high budget show or whatever. That's the point there. Glaucon says, yeah, I've seen that. I have seen that. Socrates says, do they not, said I, resemble the faces of adolescents, young but not really beautiful, when the bloom of youth abandons them? What? Okay, now Socrates is talking about young boys. I'm not going to decode that one. By all means, Glaucon says. Okay. Come then, said Socrates, consider this point. The creator of the phantom, the imitator, we say, knows nothing of the reality, but only the appearance. Right, Socrates, is that not so? Right. So you've just admitted, because if Homer and the other poets really knew what they were talking about, they would do the things that they know. They would do those things. But instead they don't. They just produced an imitation of it. And if they only produced the imitation, then they must not know what they're talking about. Because if they did, they wouldn't have produced the imitation. They would have just done the real thing. Yes, said Glaucon. Let us not, then, leave it half said, but consider it fully. Speak on, said Glaucon. Socrates says, the painter, we say, will paint both the reins and a bit, which is the part of a horse. Now he's talking about a horse. The reins of the horse and the bit, right? That's part of the horse that's essential for horse riding, I guess, right? Or charioteering, I guess. Glaucon says, yes. Socrates says, but the maker will be the cobbler and the smith. Right? Certainly. Said Glaucon. Okay. Does the painter then know the proper quality of the reins and the bit? Or does not even the maker, the cobbler, and the smith know that, but only the man who understands the use of these things, the horseman? Right? So he's saying that the painter of parts of a chariot is even further removed from the truth than just the 3-stage imitation, right? Because even a craftsman doesn't necessarily know as much about what makes a good piece of equipment as the person who's using it, right? So it's the person who's using the equipment, the maker of the equipment, and the painter of the equipment. And Socrates is saying, well, the only person who really knows what makes a thing good or bad is the person who's using it, not even necessarily the maker of it. Presumably the maker of it has a better idea than the painter, but the one who's using it has the best idea. Most true, said Glaucon. And shall we not say that the same holds true of everything? Says Socrates. What do you mean? That there are some 3 arts concerned with everything: the user's art, the maker's, and the imitator's. Yeah, said Glaucon. Socrates says, now do not the excellence, the beauty, the rightness of every implement, living thing, and action refer solely to the use for which it is made or by nature adapted? Right, so here's a functional or teleological definition of goodness or beauty or rightness, right? Which is that, it's a teleological claim here, that we define the excellence, goodness, and beauty of a thing of how well it does its job, right? How well it does its job. That's how we define a thing as good or bad, right? So a good set of glasses is going to be a set of glasses that actually improves my vision in the way that it's meant to improve. A good eye, for example, is going to be an eye that can see clearly, that can see well, right? That's what makes an eye good or excellent, right? And similarly for crafted things, right? A good bit or rein in horse riding is going to be one that has the right sort of quality, right? The proper quality, right? Only the charioteer, right? The person who's actually using that equipment is going to be able to identify that, right? It quite necessarily follows, Socrates says, then, that the user of anything is the one who knows most of it by experience, and that he reports to the maker as the good or bad effects in the use of the thing he uses. As, for example, the flute player reports to the flute maker which flutes respond and serve rightly in flute playing, and will order the kind that must be made, and the other will obey and serve him. Right? Of course, says Glaucon. Right? So, the person who really knows is the one who's using the stuff. Right? The flute player knows what makes a good flute. Right? The musician knows what makes a good musical instrument. Not necessarily the craftsman. Right? The craftsman sort of just makes the thing to the specifications. You can be good or bad at crafting a thing to the specifications, but only the player really knows what makes it good or bad. That's the argument here. Socrates says, the one then, possessing knowledge, reports about the goodness or badness of the flutes, and then the other, believing, will make them. Yes, said Glaucon. Socrates says, then, in respect of the same implement, the maker will have the right belief about its excellence and defects from association with the man who knows and being compelled to listen to him, but the user will have the true knowledge. Certainly, right? So the point here is that when a craftsman, when somebody who makes an instrument, for example, is told, this is what I want, because this is the sort of sound that I want, and this is a good sound. I'm a player, I'm a musician, I know what sounds good, I'm telling you, make it this way so it sounds like that, and that's how you make it well. That's how you make it a good instrument, right? But the craftsman doesn't necessarily know, right? He's just taking basically the knowledge on authority, right? He's taking the belief on authority that the thing, what makes a thing good or not, right? Yeah, that sounds right. Socrates says, and will the imitator from experience or use have the knowledge whether the things he portrays or are not? The things he portrays are or are not beautiful and right? Or will he, from compulsory association with the man who knows and taking orders from him for the right making of them, have right opinion? Glaucon says neither. Right? Neither, because the imitator isn't going to be somebody who has knowledge from experience, right? Because if they did have knowledge from experience, then they would do the thing itself, not imitate it. Or will he, from compulsory association, right? So like a carpenter or an instrument maker has compulsory association with expert musicians, right? But the imitator, the poet, doesn't have any compulsory association, right? The imitator or poet just, they could learn more about the thing, but they don't. Because if they did know more about the thing, then they would do the thing, right? So neither, says Glaucon. Socrates says, then the imitator will neither know nor opine rightly concerning the beauty or the badness of his imitations. Well, it seems not, says Glaucon. Socrates says, most charming, then, would be the state of mind of the poetical imitator in respect of true wisdom about his creations. Not at all, said Glaucon. Right, so what's this? Do we have a note about charming? That's a interesting use of charming. It's ironic. And Kalon, but Glaucon takes it seriously. Oh, okay. Okay, Socrates says, yet still he will nonetheless imitate, although in every case he does not know in what way the thing is good or bad. But as it seems, the thing he will imitate will be the thing that appears beautiful to the ignorant multitude. Glaucon says, well, why? What else? Well, what else? Of course, yeah, naturally. If you're a poet or a creator of some sort of media or whatever, and you want to portray something, you're going to portray it as glamorous, right? You're going to portray it as a good example of the thing itself, right? A cowboy in an old Western movie or whatever. You're going to portray that as being glamorous, and you're going to portray that as good, even if you don't know anything about cowboys or what it was like back in the 1800s on the frontier, right? Socrates says, on this, then, as it seems, we are fairly agreed that the imitator knows nothing worth mentioning of the things he imitates, but that imitation is a form of play, not to be taken seriously, and that those who attempt tragic poetry, whether in iambics or heroic verse, are altogether imitators. By all means, says Glaucon. Okay. So there we go. That was section 4. Yeah. A lot going on there. I don't even know if I can summarize it real quick. Yeah, so imitators don't know anything. That's the thesis, right? That's the idea. They don't really know what they're talking about, because if they did, they would do the thing. They would do the thing itself if they actually knew about it, but they don't. That's why they imitate, and they can't actually distinguish between good or bad instances of the thing because they don't actually have access to the experts by compulsion, right? They're not constantly exposed to experts by their own trade, right? So they don't have the I don't want to say excuse, but they don't have the reason of, say, an instrument creator, an instrument maker. They don't have the reason to engage with the experts, right? The expert musician on the topic of what makes an instrument good or bad. They just imitate, well, kind of willy-nilly, right? And they just go with whatever looks good and sell it to the audience on that basis, right? So there you go. Part 5. In heaven's name, then, this business of imitation is concerned with the third removed from the truth, right? For 3 times removed from truth, is it not? Right, so now we're back to this point about imitation is 3 times removed from the truth, and the poets are imitators, right? They are definitely imitators. I guess that was like the main thesis of sections 3 and 4, right? Poets are definitely imitators. Yes, said Glaucon. And now again, to what element in man is its function and potency related? Okay, now we're talking about something different. Glaucon says, of what are you speaking? Of what are you talking about, Socrates? What element in man is its function and potency related? What? Okay, Socrates now says, okay, he's going to clarify. Of this, the same magnitude, I presume, viewed from near and from far, does not appear equal. Glaucon says, why, no. Socrates says, and the same thing appears bent and straight to those who view them in water and out, or concave and convex, owing to similar errors of vision about colors. And there is obviously every confusion of this sort in other souls. So he's talking about perception, right? So things look different when we look at them from different angles, right? But we know that, in fact, we know the truth of the matter very often, right? We know that appearances can be deceiving, and we correct our understanding in spite of the way things appear to us somehow, right? Or sometimes, or often, right? So like if I look outside, if I look at the sun, or if I look at the moon, it looks very small in the sky, looks about this big, but really both of those things are much bigger, right? And so scene painting and its exploitation of this weakness of our nature falls nothing short of witchcraft, and so do jugglery and many other contrivances. Right? So when a painting perceives, or when a painting or an imitator creates an impression of a thing that's misleading, right? And that we don't actually know the truth of the matter, and we can't know the truth of the matter, but we're just being given a presentation of the thing, and we don't have any expertise that could confirm or deny the thing. Basically, it's it's an exploitation of the weakness of our nature, and it's a kind of witchcraft, basically. Glaucon says, true. Yeah. Socrates says, and have not measuring and numbering and weighing proved to be the most gracious aids to prevent the domination in our soul of the apparently greater or less or more or heavier, and to give control to that which has reckoned and numbered or even weighed, right? So, and isn't it great that we have ways, we have standards that we can apply to correct or to clarify our perceptions of things, right? So we're not really good at, like, if you were to hand me 2 objects and say, which one weighs more, I could probably tell you which one weighs more. But if you ask me how heavy is the thing, I couldn't give you a really precise answer because I'm not so good at that. What do you do instead? You put it on a scale, right? And a scale is going to tell you the truth of how much a thing weighs, right? Which is much better than our perceptions. And Socrates is saying, isn't it great that we have those tools? Glaucon says, certainly. Socrates says, but this surely would be the function of the part of the soul that reasons and calculates. Okay, so now he's talking about reason, right? And that's what was going back here, right? To what element in man is its function and potency related? Right, to the part of the soul that reasons and calculates, right? To the rational part of the soul, right? We see the world, we see our appearances of things, and they can give us impressions of things that are either on point or off kilter, and reason can come in and calculate and give us the right answer instead, right? In spite of the way things appear. Socrates says, and often when this is measured and declares that certain things are larger or that some are smaller than others or equal, there is at the same time an appearance to the contrary. Says, yes, sometimes that happens. Oh, this looks really, really big, or that looks level to me, and then you take a level and you find out, oh, no, it's actually not. Or that looks straight to me, and then you take a line or a plumb line and you say, no, actually it's not straight. Right? We do that. That's like the rational part of our soul overriding our impressions or of things. And did we not say, said Socrates, that it is impossible for the same thing at one time to hold contradictory opinions about the same thing? Glaucon says, yes, and we were right in affirming that. Socrates says, the part of the soul, then, that opines in contradiction of measurement could not be the same with that which conforms to it. Glaucon says, why, no, of course. Socrates says, but further, that which puts its trust in measurement and reckoning must be the best part of the soul. Right? So the rational part of the soul is best. Again, this is Plato's like division of the soul. Right? Surely, Glaucon says. Socrates says, then that which opposes it must belong to the inferior element of the soul. Well, yes, necessarily, says Glaucon. Socrates says, this then is what I wished to have agreed upon when I said that poetry, and in general the mimetic art, produces a product that is far removed from the truth in the accomplishment of its task, and associates with the part in us that is remote from intelligence, and it is its companion and friend for no sound and true purpose. Right, so this is why. That's what I mean. That's why we're getting rid of poetry. Right? Because it's far removed from the truth in the accomplishment of whatever the task might be, and it associates with the less, or the inferior part of our soul, which is the rational and calculating part, which is in opposition to the rational and calculating part. By all means, said Glaucon, right? Mimetic art, Socrates says, then is an inferior thing cohabiting with an inferior and engendering inferior offspring. It seems so, says Glaucon. Does that, says Socrates, hold only for vision, or does it apply also to the hearing and to what we call poetry? Presumably, Glaucon says, to that also. Socrates says, let us not then trust solely to the plausible analogy from painting, but let us approach in turn that part of the mind to which mimetic poetry appeals, and see whether it is inferior or the nobly serious part, right? So let's see which part of the soul poetry appeals to. Let's not just use this analogy. Let's actually look and say, which part of the soul does poetry appeal to? Right? This is all from like analogy. This is all from argument. Let's not just rely on the analogy from painting, right, which has been doing a lot of the work in this argument. Let's look directly at whether poetry works on or influences the inferior part of the soul, which is driven by appearances and emotion and things like that, or the noble, serious part of the soul that trades in calculation and reason and rationality. So we must, said Glaucon. Socrates says, let us then put the question thus. Mimetic poetry, we say, imitates human beings acting under compulsion or voluntarily, and as a result of their actions, supposing themselves to have fared well or ill, and in all this feeling either grief or joy. Did we find anything else but this? Sorry, I just got a system message. Let me do something. Okay. Are we good? Yeah, we're good. Okay. Let us then put the question thus. Mimetic poetry, we say, imitates human beings acting under compulsion or voluntarily, and as a result of their actions supposing themselves to have fared well or ill, and in all this feeling either grief or joy. Do we find anything else but this, right? So he's just describing what happens in a play or a poem, right? That's it, right? It's just people doing stuff either on their own or under compulsion, and good things or bad things happen, and they're either happy or sad, right? Glaucon says, yeah, that's about it. Socrates says, is a man, then, in all this of one mind with himself, or just as in the domain of sight there was a friction and strife, and he had held within himself contrary opinions at the same time about these same things? So also in our actions is there division and strife of the man with himself. But I recall that there is no need now of our seeking agreement on this point. For in our former discussion we were sufficiently agreed that our soul at any one moment teems with countless such self-contradictions, right? So people are in states of self-contradiction and friction and competing ideas and conflicting ideas all the time, right? Right? Glaucon says, yes, rightly so. Yes, rightly, said Socrates. But what we then omitted must now, I think, be set forth. Glaucon said, what is that? What a good and reasonable man, said I, experiences such a stroke of fortune as the loss of a son or anything else that he holds most dear, we said, I believe then too he will bear it more easily than the other sort. Oh, okay. When a reasonable and good person experiences some sort of tragedy, he's going to handle things better than an unreasonable person, right? Glaucon says yes. But now let us consider this. Will he feel no pain, or, since that is impossible, shall we say that he will in some sort be moderate in his grief? Glaucon says yes, that is rather the truth, right? Somebody who's rational and deals with some tragedy is going to be more moderate in their grief. Socrates says, tell me now about this man. Do you think that he will be more likely to resist and fight against his grief when he is observed by his equals, or when he is in solitude and alone by himself? Glaucon says, well, he'd be much more restrained, Glaucon says, when he is on view. Right? But Socrates says, but when he is left alone, I fancy he will permit himself many utterances which, if heard by another, would put him into shame, and will do many things which he would not consent to have another see him doing. So it is, he says, right? So a person who's rational and dealing with a tragedy is going to handle things better, but still it's going to be different whether he's being, viewed publicly versus whether he's, in the privacy of his own home. He might, cry like a baby or whatever, right? There's going to be a difference there, right? Says Socrates. Yes, so it is, says Glaucon. Okay. And that's the end of book 5. Okay, or part 5. It's part 6. There's 9 parts total to this first half, so we got a couple more to go. How are we doing on time? Oh, under 2 hours. Okay, we're all right. Cool. Book 6, right? So we've just set up that distinction between a reasonable person handling a tragedy better than an unreasonable person, but of course not perfectly, because that's impossible. You're going to feel some pain, and you're going to have a private face and a public face about things, right? Okay. Socrates says, now is it not reason and law that exhorts him to resist, while that which urges him to give way to his grief is the bare feeling itself? Glaucon says, true. Yeah, so reason and the law and other forces come in and say, hey, maybe don't be so miserable. Don't get so upset. Don't embarrass yourself by being, all sad and unpleasant all the time out in the public sphere. Do that stuff at home. But when you're out in public, you got to put on a face. You got to toughen up. You got to be rational about things, right? Glaucon says, yes, true. And Socrates says, and where there are 2 opposite impulses in a man at the same time about the same thing, we say that there must needs be 2 things in him. Yeah, of course, said Glaucon. And is not the one prepared to follow the guidance of the law as the law leads and directs? Oh, and is not the one, right, one of the 2 things, prepared to follow the guidance of the law as the law leads and directs. And of course, he's assuming that the law is rational, I'm pretty sure, right? Because of course this, or at least he has respect for the law. He has healthy respect for the law. How so, says Glaucon. Socrates says, the law, I suppose, declares that it is best to keep quiet as far as possible in calamity, and not to chafe and repine, because we cannot know what is really good and evil in such things, and it advantages us nothing to take them hard, and nothing in mortal life is worthy of great concern, and our grieving checks the very thing we need to come to our aid as quickly as possible in such thing, in such case, right? So this is kind of a very stoic idea here, right, where when something really bad happens to you, it's best not to, outwardly grieve so much because we cannot know what is really good and evil in things, right? Because our perspective is limited, and if something bad happens or something appears to us to happen that's bad, we don't actually know whether it might be good, right? We don't actually know that for certain. So it's about stoic humility and modesty. And again, go watch my Epictetus video if you want to learn more about Stoicism. Right? And and when we are sort of absorbed in grief and miserable and upset and depressed about some bad thing happen, this grieving checks, meaning it stops or resists or eliminates the opportunity for the very thing we need to come to our aid as quickly as possible in such case, right? I mean, we get in our own way when we grieve too much. But that point needs some clarification, so Glaucon says, what do you mean by that? Socrates says, to deliberate about what has happened to us and, as it were, in the fall of the dice, to determine the movements of our affairs with reference to the numbers that turn up in the way that reason indicates would be the best. And instead of stumbling like children, clapping one's hand to the stricken spot, and wasting the time in wailing, ever to accustom the soul to devote itself at once to the curing of the hurt and to the raising up of what has fallen, banishing threnody by therapy. Right? So when we grieve too much, we get in the way of what we need to do the most, which is to think clearly, to think through the situation, to do what must be done, to do our best, to accept our fate, to accept the situation, to accept where the chips have fallen, and move on rationally. And when we're sort of absorbed in grief, we don't do that, right? That gets in the way. We don't do that. Glaucon says, yes, that certainly would be the best way to face misfortune and deal with it. Yes, indeed. Again, very stoic. Very stoic. Socrates says, then, we say, the best part of us is willing to conform to these precepts of reason. Glaucon says, yeah, obviously. Socrates says, and shall we not say that the part of us that leads us to dwell in memory or on our suffering and impels us to lamentation and cannot get enough of that sort of thing is the irrational and idle part of us, and the associate of cowardice, right? So if we just want to sit and dwell in our misery and be, all mad and sad and upset about stuff, that's a bad thing, right? That's an irrational and idle part of the soul, the associate of cowardice. Glaucon says, yes, indeed. Yeah, we'll say that. Socrates says, and does not the fretful part of us present many and varied occasions for imitations, while the intelligent and temperate disposition, always remaining approximately the same, is neither easy to imitate nor to be understood when imitated, especially by a nondescript mob assembled in the theater? For the representation imitates a type that is alien to them. Right. Okay. So what he's saying here is, isn't it much easier to present a caricature, right? Somebody in an exaggerated emotional state, rather than somebody who's cool, collected, and rational and kind of normal. Or, well, I don't want to say normal, but like boring and rational about stuff. I'm not talking about like the trope of the super genius, eccentric, like, really intelligent know-it-all type on, in a show or in a book or something. But the flawed version of that, the Hollywood version of that, which is like kind of done up and a caricature, right? He says, yeah. Socrates says, and is it not obvious that the nature of the mimetic poet is not related to this better part of the soul, and his cunning is not framed to please it, if he is to win favor with the multitude, but is devoted to the fretful and complicated type of character because it is easy to imitate? Right? So not only is it better storytelling to, make a story about a conflicted character, but it's just easier to write that way, right? It's more difficult to write a story about somebody who's sensible, got it all figured out, doesn't have any tragic flaws, right? Somebody who knows what's going on and acts in a rational and reasonable way, right? All that. That's much more difficult to write. It is obvious, said Glaucon. Okay. This consideration, says Socrates, then makes it right for us to proceed to lay hold of him and set him down as the counterpart of the painter. For he resembles him in that his creations are inferior in respect of reality, and the fact that his appeal is to the inferior part of the soul and not to the best part is another point of resemblance. And so we may at last say that we should be justified in not admitting him into a well-ordered state, because he stimulates and fosters this element in the soul, namely the inferior part of the soul, and by strengthening it tends to destroy the rational part, just as when in a state one puts bad men in power and turns the city over to them and ruins the better sort. Precisely in the same manner we shall say that the mimetic poet sets up in each individual a soul of vicious constitution by fashioning phantoms far removed from reality and by currying favor with the senseless element that cannot distinguish the greater from the less, but calls the same thing now one, now the other. By all means, says Glaucon. Yeah. Okay. So that's a really nice statement of the whole thing, right? Where, because the poet is far removed from the truth, and influences or trades in or strengthens or appeals to the less rational part of the audience's soul. And that's a bad thing, right? That's not good. Section 7. But we have not yet brought our chief accusation against it. Okay, so that's not even the main argument, I guess. Its power to corrupt, with rare exceptions, even the better sort is surely the chief cause for alarm, right? So the real problem is that poetry corrupts people. How could it be otherwise if it really does that, says Glaucon. Socrates says, listen and reflect. I think you know that the very best of us, even when we hear Homer or some of the other makers of tragedy imitating one of the heroes who is in grief, and is delivering a long tirade in his lamentations or chanting and beating his breast, feel pleasure and abandon ourselves and accompany the representation with sympathy and eagerness, and we praise as an excellent poet the one who most strongly affects us in this way. Right? I do know it, of course, says Glaucon. Right, so he's saying, look, no matter how rational you or I may be, and of course we're very rational, right? When we see a good show and we feel the sadness of the character on the screen, or we feel the anger of the character on the screen, we treat it as a sign of quality of the show, its ability to make us feel sympathy for the characters, right? We want relatable characters. We want characters that we can sympathize and empathize with, right? No matter how rational we are. Says, yes, I know that. Okay, but Socrates says, but when in our own lives some affliction comes to us, you are also aware that we plume ourselves upon the opposite, on our ability to remain calm and endure, in the belief that this is the conduct of a man, and what we were praising in the theater, that of a woman. Okay, so this is just, classic ancient Greek sexism, right? A man is rational, a woman is emotional, right? So there you go. This is a very old bit of writing, and I don't even think, I think this I don't think this is like a Victorian 20th century, 19th century translation thing. This is like a 2,500-year-old ancient Greek thing. So this goes back quite a bit. Right? The rational conduct of a man who can calmly endure a hardship versus, a hysterical woman who can't. That's the contrast. You don't have to like it, but that's what Plato's going with there. Do you think then, said Socrates, that the praise is rightfully bestowed when contemplating a character that we would not accept but would be ashamed of in ourselves? We do not abominate it, but take pleasure in it and approve. And Glaucon says, no, by Zeus, it doesn't seem reasonable. Socrates says, oh yes, said I, if you would consider it in this way. In what way, says Glaucon. And here goes Socrates again. So this is a long one. If you would reflect on the part of the soul that in the former case, in our own misfortune, was forcibly restrained, and that is hungered for tears and a good cry and satisfaction, because it is its nature to desire these things, is the element in us that the poets satisfy and delight, and that the best element in our nature, since it has never been properly educated by reason or even by habit, then relaxes its guard over the plaintive part, inasmuch as this is contemplating the woes of others, and it is no shame in it to praise and pity another who, claiming to be a good man, abandons himself to excess in this grief. But it thinks this vicarious pleasure is so much clear gain, and would not consent to forfeit it by disdaining the poem altogether. That is, I think, because few are capable of reflecting that what we enjoy in others will inevitably react upon ourselves. For after feeding fat the emotion of pity there, it is not easy to restrain it in our own sufferings. Right. So the idea is that if we get used to empathizing and sympathizing and we're constantly influenced by this overwhelming, overdone, emotional caricature depictions of people dealing with difficult situations, dealing with tragedy and being overcome with emotion or grief, it's going to rub off on us, and we're going to end up being too emotional in our own lives, right? Because, especially if our reason is not cultivated enough, if we don't know any better, we're going to see that and we're going to want to imitate that. And that's the sense in which poetry corrupts. Most true, said Glaucon. Okay. Socrates says, does not the same principle apply to the laughable? Namely, that if in comic representations, or for that matter in private talk, you take intense pleasure in buffooneries that you would blush to practice yourself, and do not detest them as base, you are doing the same thing as in the case of the pathetic, meaning in the case of tragedy. For here again, what your reason, for fear of the reputation of buffoonery, restrained in yourself when it fain would play the clown, you release in turn, and so fostering its youthful impudence, let yourself go so far that often ere you are aware, you become yourself a comedian in private. Right. So again, this idea that comedy and off-color jokes can seep in to your character really and influence you if you don't know any better. Even if you do know any better, just the constantly laughing at off-color jokes or bad humor is somehow negatively affecting the rational part of you. It's placating to the inferior part of your soul, and that's a bad thing. Yes, indeed, says Glaucon. And Socrates says, and so in regard to the emotions of sex and anger, and all the appetites and pains and pleasures of the soul, which we say accompany all our actions, the effect of poetic imitation is the same. For it waters and fosters these feelings when what we ought to do is dry them up, and it establishes them as our rulers when they ought to be ruled, to the end that we may be better and happier men instead of worse and more miserable. right? So poetry sort of encourages the worst part of ourselves, right? Because it portrays characters on the screen that are overdone and easy to empathize with, and we make excuses for them, and we say, oh, well, that's just fantasy, that doesn't really affect me, but it actually does, especially if we don't know any better and we haven't learned how to properly use reason. We're just going to see that stuff and imitate it eventually. It's going to seep into us. And when it does that, it's going to make everything worse, because when we live a life that's ruled by our emotions rather than by reason, we end up worse off, right? I cannot deny it, said Glaucon. Then Glaucon, said Socrates, when you meet encomiasts? I don't know that word. Encomiast. That's a Greek root for an old English word that I don't know, actually. Then, Glaucon, when you meet encomiasts of Homer who tell us that this poet has been the educator of Hellas, meaning Greek, or Greece, right, the Hellenistic world, and that for the conduct and refinement of human life he is worthy of our study and devotion, and that we should order our entire lives by the guidance of this poet, we must love and salute them as doing the best they can, and concede to them that Homer is the most poetic of the poets and the first of the tragedians, but we must know the truth, that we can admit no poetry into our city save only hymns to the gods and to the praises of good men. For if you grant admission to the honeyed muse in lyric or epic, pleasure and pain will be the lords of your city instead of law, and that which shall from time to time have approved itself to the general reason as the best. Most true, he says. Okay, so there you go. So anyone who says that, Homer is great and he's an educator and he's so wise, and, great poetry can educate us, and fiction and art is a reflection of human nature and can educate people and enhance people's lives and make people live better lives. Socrates is saying that is all, as we have just argued, totally false. That is wrong. That's no good. We got to ban the poets from our city. Otherwise, all hell will break loose. Otherwise, we're going to live according to emotions rather than reason and laws. And because there's going to be poetry everywhere, and people are going to be influenced in ways that are not good, and they're not going to develop rationally, and all hell is going to break loose. Right? Pleasure and pain will be the lords of your city instead of law. Okay. Section 8. I think this is the last one. Let us then conclude our return to the topic of poetry and our apology, and affirm that we really had good grounds then for dismissing her from our city, since such was her character, and her is, female representation of poetry. Such was her character. For reason constrained us, right? So again, here's this idea of the rational part of the soul dominating over the emotional part of the soul, which would lead us towards misery, right? The rational part is the one that we should cultivate. It's the one that we should promote. It's the one that we should listen to. It's the one that always gives us the right answer, right? And poetry gets in the way of that. And here Socrates is demonstrating a case of that, right? He's saying reason is constraining us. Reason is telling us that we need to get rid of poetry. Even though I really like it. I'm a big fan of Homer. It's a lot of fun. I love going to the plays and seeing it, and it's wonderful, and I love empathizing with all the characters, and I love the stories. But, really, it shouldn't exist. It really shouldn't exist. Reason has constrained us. And let us further say to her, lest she condemn us for harshness and rusticity, that there is from an old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. For such expressions as the yelping hound barking at her master, and mighty in the idle of babble of fools, and the mob that masters those who are too wise for their own good, and the subtle thinkers who reason that after all they are poor, and countless others are tokens of this ancient enmity. I don't really know what's going on here, to be honest. I guess there's an old conflict between poetry and philosophy. I think Aristotle talks about this, actually. So maybe we'll learn more when we get to him. I want to do Aristotle's Poetics in another video. But nevertheless, let it be declared that if the mimetic and dulcet poetry can show any reason for her existence in a well-governed state, we would gladly admit her, since we ourselves are very conscious of her spell. Meaning, if there is a good reason to allow poetry into the state, show me, because I really like it, and I want nothing more than to accept poetry into the ideal state, because I really like it. But, reason has constrained us, right? But all the same, it would be impious to betray what we believe to be the truth. Is that not so, friend? Right? Isn't that true? Do not you yourself feel her magic, and especially when Homer and his interpreter, or especially when Homer is her interpreter, right? Don't you wish that we could have a good reason to allow poetry into society? Greatly, says Glaucon. Socrates says, then may she not justly return from this exile after she has pleaded her defense, whether in lyric or other measure? Glaucon says, by all means, yes. Socrates says, and we would allow her advocates who are not poets but lovers of poetry to plead her cause in prose without meter, and show that she is not only delightful but beneficial to orderly government and to the life and to all the life of men. And we shall listen benevolently, for it will be clear gain for us if it can be shown that she bestows not only pleasure but benefits. How could we help being the gainers? Said Glaucon. Socrates says, but if not, my friend, even as men who have fallen in love, if they think that the love is not good for them, hard though it be, nevertheless refrain, so we, owing to the love of this kind of poetry, inbred in us by our education in these fine polities of ours, will gladly have the best possible case made out for her goodness and truth, but so long as she is unable to make good her defense, we shall chant over to ourselves, as we listen, the reasons that we have given as a counter-charm to her spell, to preserve us from slipping back into the childish loves of the multitudes. For we have come to see that we must not take such poetry seriously as a serious thing, that lays hold on the truth, but that he who lends an ear to it must be on his guard, fearing for the polity in his soul, and must believe that what we have said about poetry. Must believe what we have said about poetry. Yeah, okay. So, if poetry could be proved to, or could be demonstrated to prove some benefit to society, then we would absolutely let it in. Absolutely, sure. But in the meantime, it seems pretty clear that poetry doesn't do anything good for the society, because it's just an imitation, it's far removed from the truth, and it appeals to the inferior part of the soul that we shouldn't be interested in cultivating in the ideal society. By all means, Glaucon says, I concur. Socrates says, yes, for great is the struggle, dear Glaucon, a far greater contest than we think it, that determines whether a man prove good or bad, so that not the lure of honor or wealth or any office, nor of poetry either, should incite us to be careless of righteousness and all excellence. I agree with you, he replied, in view of what we had set forth, and I think that anyone else would do so too. Okay. That's it. That's all I wanted to get through today. That is the first part of Book 10 of the Republic. We see Socrates' argument against poetry. There you go. So that's why poetry should be banned from the ideal city. And all fiction, really. And again, I think of this, I mean, it's an ancient Greek work. It's talking about poetry, and, nobody, who reads poems anymore? I don't know. I sure don't. Maybe I should. Maybe I'm just not learned enough. But, this was the equivalent of like Netflix, right? Or TV shows or movies, right? And the arguments apply to like kind of any fictional media franchise or product or whatever, right? Where, these are caricatures, not the real thing, right? Especially, I gave the examples. I think they're pretty good examples of like House, or like a medical drama, or like in the 90s you had all those like law drama movies, like The Firm or whatever, where that's not how a law firm works, right? That's not what doctors really do. That's not what what law enforcement is really like. These sort of Hollywood done up characters and caricatures of different industries and crafts and things that really aren't good representations of what that's like. And Plato thinks that the cost of doing that and the effect that it has on the masses who don't know any better and who see this stuff, because it's not just the details of the craft that the media gets wrong, and by the media I mean the show or the movie or the series, right? They don't just get the details wrong, but often they get the morals wrong. And that's the real problem that Socrates has here, is that it corrupts people by giving them constant bad information or constant bad examples of how to live well, right? And if you spend your time just watching examples of how to live poorly, how to be overly emotional, how to how not to react to tragedies, for example, or how not to treat other people, you're going to end up worse off, right? And if a lot of people watch that stuff, if this stuff is all throughout society and constantly influencing people, then a whole lot of people are going to end up confused and corrupted and not the best they could be. And for that reason, get rid of it, according to Plato. Do I agree with that? I don't know. Probably not. It's a little extreme. I don't even think Plato agreed with it. I mean, he it's sort of utopian rational vision where it's like, well, here are the arguments. If you want to make a case that the good outweighs the bad, go for it. But in the meantime, with the arguments that I've offered here, it's got to go. Yeah. So that's it. That's Plato's argument against poetry in the Republic. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some stuff. And yeah, that's it. I will see you in the next video.